Hi class, this is Mr. McNellis again. Okay, we're going to try to go through a series of these tonight. I'm going to try to go through the insert A, B, and C. But I think first what I'm going to look for, we're going to do today, right now, we're going to go to insert A. Notice in insert A, okay, what we're looking at here is we're looking at arguments. And we're also looking at non-arguments. This particular assignment is connected to chapter 1, okay? And more importantly, it's really the first two sections of chapter 1. So let me give you an example. When we're looking at a passage, okay, such as here, if we look at this example down here, when we're looking at a passage, any passage in this assignment, it can either be, okay, it can either be an argument or it can be, right, a non-argument. And what's really fascinating is eventually you'll find that we're going to learn argument patterns. So that they're patterns of arguments. And so, for example, if you, as you've read in chapter 4, um, there's inductive arguments and deductive arguments. But and what you'll find is that there are actually patterns. So if I have a pattern of an argument, so if something is a prediction or it's a generalization or it's a hypothetical syllogism, all of that's going to mean right away that it's an argument. But also, we also have what we call patterns of non-arguments. Patterns of non-arguments are also something we can identify based on the pattern or the structure of what's happening in the passage. And what you have here on this particular insert, it does call, for example, if you look at when you look at a passage and let's say you identify it as a non-argument, what this assignment's asking you to do is if you look at these four, right, it's giving you four different types of patterns of non-argument. Like for example, it's going to say number one, okay, so it's a conditional statement. Number two, the passage is just an explanation, okay. Passage number three, it's saying it's a report. And number four, it's saying just no particular plain, no, there's just no evidence. Those are definitely patterns, and our book talks about each of those. Our book does talk about conditional statements, okay? Our book does talk about explanations. Our book does talk about, I think it does talk about reports. And of course, if there's no actual inference being made, then it is a non-argument. Um, but on that note, if what I want to show you, there's also other non-argument patterns, so that go extend that beyond, okay, beyond this particular assignment. So these may help you too as you go through this. But just the insert A isn't going to recognize it. So if you go to your textbook and you go to, I believe, page 31, okay, and on page 31, what you'll find is you'll see, look, whoa, patterns of non-arguments. And that's going to be key, right? Because what we have is like in logic, we call these passages non-arguments precisely because these passages meet the criteria of having more than one statement, but an argument is in fact not present, okay? And so that's the key. And um, but what's interesting here is it's this particular definition is a little bit misleading because it says because these passages meet the criteria of having right more than one statement, but an argument right is not in fact present. Now, what that means is you actually can have one statement, right? But that typically that doesn't meet a pattern of non-argument. I mean, just precisely because it's a type of statement. If you have one statement, it's not really a passage, right? So if there's one statement, it automatically cannot be an argument. That's why it says it has to have more than one. But right, if it is a passage, that means there's more than one statement, but the statements are not like one is not proving the other true. And what we find is, in fact, there are different types of patterns of non-arguments, one of which, of course, is expository. Expository are really, really they're passages, okay, that provide just information. So if I'm talking about, for example, a city like Cayucus, I'm just telling you basically facts. These are things that are going to be like things you find in encyclopedia. Um, but notice too, right, it's going to also describe, as the inserts ask, like you could have a conditional statement that's a non-argument. I'm not going to go through this. I advise that you seriously read this section. Very, very important, okay? But as you're talking about an if-then statement, okay, so a conditional is always, okay, an if-then statement. And what you find is An if-then statement in and of it by itself can never be an argument. So if I say if it rains, then the grass gets wet, um, or I could even say something like this: Hey, if it rains, then the grass gets wet, and I'm going to wear my boots. That itself is still one single conditional statement. And what we find in logic is one conditional statement by itself is not an argument. So the only way a conditional statement can it can be it can turn into it can turn into an argument if in fact you have other statements. Okay, so I think let me see if they give you an example. Okay, let's see. I don't like any of those, but let's do this. I'm going to show you this. Watch what we'll do here. This is kind of cool. Okay, if I do this, non-arguments. If I do something, not sure what happened there. What happened? Doot. Okay, not sure what happened. I think it just disappeared. Where'd it go? Okay, not sure. Anyway, not sure what happened. Let's do eraser, erase that point. Doot, doot. So if I have something like, right, if it rains, then the grass gets wet, that by itself cannot be an argument. But if I add something else, like let's say, for example, I go outside and it is raining. Well, now I've got two pieces of evidence, right? I have a hypothetical, right, which is right here. This is your conditional, right, which is really nothing other than what we call a conditional statement. It's a conditional statement. So what I have is if I have a conditional statement and then I have this other piece of evidence, then it actually turns out like if it rains and the grass gets wet, let's say it happens to be raining. Well, if that's the case, between those two statements, I can add a third, namely what? It's the grass is wet. So in this case, you do have a conditional, but it actually turns out to be an argument. Okay, why does it turn out to be an argument? Because you have more than one statement. You don't just have right just one. But if I had if it rains, then grass gets wet, that by itself is not a non-argument for two reasons. Well, right, because one, there's only, right, I mean, well, you do have two statements here, but in logic, the whole thing is counted as one single statement. So, having said that, okay, I'm going back here and going back to, so I advise that you read this little section on non-arguments. Also, explanations, very important. Explanations are very important because in one part, it does here talks about explanandum and explanandums, but it's one simple thing. When you're dealing with explanations, you're always going from, so an easy way to memorize this is to think of it as here, we'll do this. Let's go back here, okay? Boop, come on. And we're going to go to the next page. How do I go to the next page on this? I actually don't know. So let's see what that does. No, no. Okay, I don't know what to do here. Maybe we just delete it. There we go. So what we have here is explanations. When you're dealing with explanations, you're typically going from like what might appear to be evidence. If I said something like this, right? A spacecraft Challenger, I might just say that, right? The Challenger no. Exploded, right? Since the O-ring failed. Notice in this example, okay, and see if I can write this a little neater. By the Challenger, I mean like the spacecraft. The space shuttle that launched and then exploded. And so what you have here is the explanation is interesting. You have two statements, okay? Here's your premise indicator, okay? And if I were to map this, since we've already done mapping, right? You would have one since two. I see this as one since 2, right? And so if I oftentimes think of sense as a premise indicator. So if I were to map it, I would think of it as something like that. However, this is deceptive because it's an explanation. An explanation is not an argument, but it sounds like an argument's being made, and it's using a premise indicator word sense. Now, the problem here, of course, is in explanations, you actually, instead of using a fact to try to convince something that you don't know to be true, you're actually, what you're trying to do is you're trying to explain, right, in this case, something that is already known, okay? And so in the form of an explanation, it turns out that you're moving from something that is unknown to known. Whereas, what do you know about arguments, right? If we do this, arguments go the opposite, right? Let's just go here. Here, we'll do, now I'm just going to do something else, okay? If I do something like this, if I go like 1 to 2, something like this, okay? Now, this is not actually tied to this, but if you look at an argument, right? Here, you're always typically, the structure is such that you're always going from something that is known, because the evidence that you provide is usually want to be factual. So in that case, you're going from something that's known to unknown, okay? And again, I fail. Boom, 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 boom. In here, yes, let's do this. Unknown. Okay. Now, so what's interesting is this is the pattern of a non-argument. This is the pattern of an argument. And that's going to be important. So when you're going through this, just remember, if what you think is a conclusion is already known, well, then it can't be something that's, in this case, and it looks like the other statements are trying to explain something we know to be true. So if I said, like, the grass is green because of the process of photosynthesis, that's an explanation, because I'm not trying to prove to you in this case that the grass is green. I'm assuming already that, but I'm actually giving you an explanation for that. Whereas with an argument, I might say, oh, look, the grass is green because we all agree that it's green. And in that case, what I'm saying is we're trying to prove to you that it's green because, in fact, right, I'm giving you a piece of evidence. The evidence itself is, right, something that I'm drawing on that is already known. Like, I'm looking at it and I see that it's green, therefore it's got to be green. And so something like that. So just know with explanations, please read the chapter on that. That's really important. I think it'll be very, very helpful for you. And so as we move through this, let's see what else we got. Notice here at the end of this, like on page 38, it's nice. It gives you, right, the difference between explanations and argument. This is what I was talking about. And what else do you have? This is really important. I would write this on a 3x5 note card, right? You have different types of non-arguments. You have just descriptions of things. You have expository. You have reports. Now remember, by conditional statements, we only mean a single one. We also have illustrations. Illustrations oftentimes use words like for example. Now, for example, what do we know about that, right? I'm running out of space. This is really funny. And so when we use for example, the key there is I can use example in two different ways, right? I can say, hey, let's talk about dinosaurs. For example, let's take the T-Rex. That's an illustration. I'm illustrating what, in fact, is what dinosaurs I want to use. But I can also use an example as, hey, you know what? I believe that, Scotch is the best kind of alcohol. And then I might say because, right? Or for example, right, if we took a Macallan 12 and we took, say, like a Corona beer, right? And we compared it and we had taste tests, it turns out Macallan 12 beats the Corona. Something like that. Well, that actually is an argument. So because I'm using an example as evidence, but I can also use, for example, to illustrate something that's not a conclusion. So that's the difference there. Explanations, of course, you go through, and of course, anything that suggests. So just know that as you go through this first assignment on insert A, you can draw from any of those, okay? You don't have to just, in this case, just look at these four. So when it does say the above passage, as I'm looking at this example, it's asking you here, right? The above passage is not an argument because now here we can draw from any of these, or you can also draw from the patterns that we learned in the book. Okay, so that's kind of like the explanation of that, and that's what will expect for you to do on the exam. So what I'm going to do now is this is sort of like part one of Insert A, giving you a background and kind of a lecture on what a non-argument pattern is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a part two of this, okay? And in that, we'll actually go through some of the problems on this sheet, okay? So let me get this off to you, and yeah, and there we go. We'll move forward. All right, look for the next one. Thank you, guys.